The cabin was tense, the kind of quiet that hums just beneath the sound of engines and whispers of fear. A U.S. Navy SEAL captain moved deliberately down the aisle, his presence enough to silence the murmurs of restless passengers. He carried himself like a man who had seen too much of war, his eyes scanning each face, searching not for comfort, but for competence. Something was wrong. Everyone could sense it. The flight had shifted from a routine journey to a crisis in midair, though only a few knew the full extent. When he stopped midway down the plane, his voice cut through the uneasy silence. "Is there a combat pilot on board?" His tone was firm, commanding, but not desperate. He wasn't pleading, he was assessing. The weight of his words seemed to press down on the entire cabin, and people looked around, hoping someone else would rise. For a long moment, no one moved. Eyes darted, some heads shook, shoulders slumped back against their seats. The thought of being responsible for hundreds of lives was enough to freeze anyone in place. Then, almost unnoticed at first, she stood. She had been quiet the entire flight, sitting in a middle row seat, blending into the crowd with a calm that now seemed unusual. Her movements were steady, measured, like someone accustomed to pressure. She didn't fumble or hesitate, just rose smoothly, as though she had already accepted what was coming. The captain's eyes locked on her immediately, sharp recognition flashing in his expression. There was no arrogance in the way she carried herself, no need to prove anything. She simply met his gaze and nodded once, silently acknowledging both the question and the responsibility. Passengers began to whisper, some in awe, others in disbelief. She didn't look like what most imagined when they pictured a combat pilot. There was no uniform, no insignia, just a quiet strength that needed no introduction. Her stillness spoke louder than any declaration could. The captain gave her a slight incline of his head, a warrior's respect to another. Without another word, she stepped into the aisle, her presence instantly shifting the mood in the cabin. Fear was still there, but now it was tempered by hope. What struck those watching wasn't her appearance, but the aura of certainty she carried. This wasn't someone volunteering out of bravado or desperation. This was someone trained for moments exactly like this, someone who had spent countless hours in the cockpit with life and death balanced on decisions made in seconds. As she walked past rows of stunned faces, people instinctively moved aside, giving her space. She didn't demand it, it was granted because they all felt it. The captain fell into step beside her, and though no details were exchanged aloud, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Whatever danger lay ahead, she was ready. In that instant, the entire atmosphere of the plane shifted. One person had stood, and in doing so, lifted the weight of helplessness from everyone else. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now direction. Where there had been fear, there was resolve. She was more than a passenger now. She was the answer to the call. The air inside the transport plane carried a heavy vibration, the kind that made every rivet seem alive with tension. The SEAL team was strapped in, their gear stacked neatly, their weapons secured. But the mood was restless. They were heading into hostile territory, and word had just come down that the extraction plan had fallen apart. The pilot had been injured during a skirmish before takeoff, and though the aircraft was still airborne, everyone knew the landing would demand a steady, experienced hand. The SEAL captain, a man seasoned by decades of deployments, unbuckled his harness and stood, scanning his team, and then the civilians seated along the side walls. His voice cut through the roar of the engines, calm but carrying an edge of urgency. "We need a combat pilot. Right now. Who among you can fly this bird?" For a moment, the silence was deafening. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some of them trained in weapons, tactics, demolitions, but none of them in piloting. The civilians looked even more stricken, eyes wide, hands clutching armrests as if holding on might make them invisible. Seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Then, with a quiet resolve that seemed almost at odds with the chaos of the situation, she rose from her seat. Her motion wasn't rushed or flamboyant. It was measured, deliberate, the kind of movement made by someone who had done this before under far worse conditions. The CLs turned to look at her, skepticism written across some faces, curiosity across others. She was dressed like any other passenger, no uniform, no outward sign of military life. But there was something in her bearing, something unshakable, that silenced the murmurs before they even started. The captain studied her for half a second, then longer, his gaze narrowing not in doubt but in recognition. He had seen that look before, steady eyes that had stared down impossible odds and refused to blink. "You?" he asked, his tone probing but without mockery. She met his stare evenly, no need for bravado. "Combat pilot. F-18s, multiple deployments." Her words were brief, clipped, spoken like someone who had no time for debate. The SEAL captain gave a curt nod, a subtle acknowledgement of her credibility. He didn't ask for proof. In moments like this, there was no room for hesitation. "You're up," he said simply, stepping aside. As she moved down the narrow aisle toward the cockpit, the atmosphere inside the plane shifted. The operators, hardened men who had seen firefights across continents, found themselves straightening unconsciously, as though they were in the presence of someone who carried authority without needing to demand it. The civilians whispered, their fear now laced with hope. She didn't pause, didn't waver, just walked forward with the quiet confidence of someone stepping back into their element. By the time she reached the cockpit door, the hum of uncertainty that had filled the aircraft was gone. In its place was a singular focus. She had answered the call, and everyone on board knew instinctively that their odds of survival had just changed. One moment of decision had altered everything. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the lifeline they hadn't dared to expect. The cockpit door slammed shut behind her, the metallic click echoing like a countdown to fate. Inside, alarms screamed in shrill tones, the control panel flashing angry red. The injured pilot slumped in his seat, pale and drifting in and out of consciousness, his hands still weakly gripping the yoke. She slid into the co-pilot's chair with practiced speed, her eyes scanning the chaos of instruments, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. Her hands moved instinctively, shutting off warnings, flipping switches, steadying the bird with a calm that belied the stakes. The SEAL captain stood just outside, braced against the frame, watching her work. He didn't interrupt, didn't question. He knew this was her battlefield now. Behind him, the rest of the team waited, their fate tethered to the hands of a woman none of them had expected to lead them. The aircraft shuddered violently, dipping hard to the right before she leveled it with a smooth correction. Her voice was steady, controlled. "Hydraulics are failing. We've got one chance at putting her down clean." The captain leaned in. "Can you do it?" She didn't look at him, didn't need to. "I've landed jets on carriers in the dead of night, during a storm, with engines on fire. I can do this." That answer silenced any lingering doubt. The SEALs exchanged glances, not with skepticism but with newfound respect. This wasn't just talk. This was someone who had stared death in the face before and refused to blink. Another violent shake rattled the cabin, baggage crashing from overhead bins, civilians crying out in panic. She tightened her grip on the controls, jaw set, eyes locked on the horizon visible through the cracked windshield. Her breathing was measured, calm, every inhale and exhale synced with the rhythm of her training. "I need everyone strapped in," she called out, her voice carrying through the open doorway. "Impact is going to be rough." The captain relayed her order, his tone as commanding as hers. Straps clicked, weapons were secured, and silence fell again, this time not from fear but from trust. Every soul on board was now looking to her, even if they couldn't see her directly. She had become the center of gravity in that aircraft. She adjusted altitude, scanning terrain ahead, searching for somewhere, anywhere, she could bring the bird down. A stretch of rough clearing came into view, half swamp, half dirt. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had. She lowered flaps, adjusted throttle, and muttered almost to herself, "All right, girl, hold together for me." The SEAL captain caught the words, recognizing the tone of someone speaking to more than just a machine. It was the voice of a warrior communing with her weapon, her partner in survival. As the ground rushed up to meet them, she set her jaw, every nerve sharpened to a point. There was no fear in her eyes, only focus, and in that heartbeat before impact. Everyone on board understood. They were in the hands of someone born for this exact moment. The aircraft screamed as it dropped lower, metal rattling against the strain of forces it was never designed to endure. The passengers gripped their seats, knuckles white, while the SEAL team braced themselves in silence, veterans of countless battles, but powerless in this one. In the cockpit, she was the only calm in the storm, her eyes locked on the crude clearing below. The engines coughed, threatening to stall. She coaxed the controls with firm, precise movements, speaking softly to the machine, as if willing it to hold together just a little longer. "Brace for landing." Her voice carried back through the cabin, strong and steady. There was no hesitation, no trace of doubt. The SEAL captain repeated the order with the force of command, but it was her tone that cut through panic like steel. The plane dipped sharply, and for a split second it felt like gravity itself had given way. Civilians screamed, gear slammed against the fuselage, but she remained unshaken, fingers dancing over switches, eyes calculating every detail of descent. The ground surged up to meet them. With a violent shudder, the wheels hit dirt, bouncing hard before catching again. Sparks erupted as metal scraped against rocks, the landing gear groaning in protest. The impact threw bodies forward, harnesses straining, loose equipment clattering in a storm of chaos. She gritted her teeth, muscles taut, as she fought the bucking controls, every instinct screaming for control where none should have been possible. The aircraft swerved dangerously to the side, threatening to roll. She countered with swift, brutal precision, dragging the plane back level, carving a straight path across the uneven terrain. Inside the cabin, the world was a blur of sound and motion, shouts, crashes, the tearing roar of steel against earth. The SEAL captain stood braced in the aisle, steadying those around him with a hand, his eyes never leaving the cockpit door. Trust was a dangerous thing in combat, but in that moment, he trusted her with everything. The plane lurched once more, bounced high, then slammed down with finality. Dust and debris exploded in clouds outside the windows as the engines howled their last dying breaths. For an agonizing heartbeat, it seemed the entire aircraft might tear itself apart. Then, at last, momentum bled away, and the massive bird shuddered to a grinding halt. Half buried in mud and dirt, silence followed, deafening after the chaos, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the faint moans of shaken passengers. She exhaled slowly, releasing the controls as though letting go of a living creature that had given its final effort. Her hands trembled only slightly, the aftershock of adrenaline catching up to her calm exterior. Behind her, the SEAL captain stepped forward, his voice low but filled with genuine respect. "Hell of a landing." She glanced back, her expression composed, almost indifferent, but her eyes carried the weight of what she had just done. "I told you, I've done worse." And with that, the spell broke. Relief surged through the cabin, civilians crying openly, soldiers exchanging glances of awe. She had turned a death sentence into survival, and though she wore no uniform, everyone knew they were alive because she had stood up when no one else could. The dust had barely begun to settle when the first sound of gunfire cracked through the clearing. The passengers flinched, some ducking instinctively, but the SEALs reacted like a coiled spring, snapping into formation. The aircraft, still groaning from its brutal landing, had become a steel coffin if they stayed inside. The captain barked orders, his voice carrying the authority of experience. Form perimeter. Get the civilians out! His men moved without hesitation, checking weapons, securing positions, eyes scanning the tree line where muzzle flashes sparked in the fading light. She stood in the cockpit doorway now, her calm composure unchanged despite the chaos erupting outside. For a moment, she could have remained in the background, her task completed, her role fulfilled. But the way she watched the unfolding situation told a different story. She hadn't just landed them. She wasn't about to leave survival to chance. The captain glanced at her, reading the intent in her stance before she even spoke. "You're not just a pilot, are you?" She gave a faint shrug, as if the truth hardly mattered. "Combat doesn't stop once you're on the ground." Before he could respond, a new volley of rounds slammed into the fuselage, punching holes through thin aluminum. Screams rose from the civilians, but the SEALs quickly shepherded them toward cover behind the wreckage. Smoke and dirt filled the air, choking and thick, but through it all she moved with the same steady resolve as before. She grabbed a fallen rifle from one of the gear crates, checked the chamber with muscle memory, and stepped into the fray as if she had always belonged there. The SEALs noticed. Warriors recognized their own, and though none of them had fought beside her before, they instantly adjusted to her presence, folding her into their line without question. Together, they returned fire, each shot methodical, precise. She knelt low, eyes sharp, tracking movements in the brush, and cutting down threats with the efficiency of someone who had spent years making life or death decisions under fire. The captain moved beside her, laying down suppressive bursts, stealing quick glances between reloads. He didn't waste words, but when their eyes met in the chaos, respect was written clear. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She was part of the fight. Minutes stretched like hours as the firefight raged. Civilians huddled behind wreckage, trembling but alive, while the SEALs and their unexpected ally held the line with unshakable grit. Slowly, the enemy's fire began to fade, their forces retreating into the shadows of the tree line. The clearing fell into uneasy silence, punctuated only by the ringing in their ears and the distant rustle of jungle. Breathless but steady, she lowered her weapon, scanning for movement. The captain broke the silence, his voice low, almost grim with admiration. "Who the hell are you?" She slung the rifle over her shoulder, her gaze hard but calm. "The one who stood up." And with that, the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone. She wasn't just the reason they had survived the crash. She was the reason they would make it through whatever came next.